I am just going to share my screen, and hello everyone that is tuning in. Nice to see you. And well, I got a lot of cool things to talk about regarding psychology and UX, so I'm just going to get started. Let me just get my presentation up and running. And yeah, I assume everything is quite all right there. Okay, here we are. So today I'm going to be talking to you about cognitive biases in user experience, but also about psychology in UX as a whole. And well, I have a lot of stuff to share, so we're just gonna get through it. And if you have any questions, you can just post them in the chat, and later on we'll get through them, and we'll probably can touch a lot of them. All right, let's get going. So I'd like to start with a story, actually. Story that I like to refer to as the struggle of the optimizer. And this is about Dave Brailsford. And maybe that name sounds familiar to you if you are into cycling. I'm not really into cycling, I'm just really into this story. So Dave Brailsford was called in and assigned as managing director of performance for the British cycling team. And this was necessary because in 2003, the British cycling team was doing so bad. They were doing so poorly that they were actually, well, their results were so bad that the companies and the brands that were supposed to sell bicycles to them were quite ashamed to have the British cycle on their bikes. So they kind of refused to do that. And then they were like, okay, this needs to go better. And Dave Brailsford came in. And he had a little bit of an unorthodox approach because he just started doing things like rubbing the bicycle tires with some kind of special alcohol to increase traction, and testing out different massage gels on the cycling members to kind of see which led to the best muscle recovery. And also, he didn't stop there. He kind of went even further, and he started ordering like pillows and mattresses and testing them all to see which would guarantee the best night of sleep. And I think he painted the inside of the van that the bicycles were transported in white so that they could spot these little particles of dust and dirt that would maybe decrease the performance. And with all these 1% optimizations, he just went to work. And now you're probably wondering, is this going to work? Well, 4 years later, when they entered into the next Olympics, they won like 60% of the gold medals. And then the year after that in the Tour de France, they even set some world records, and they just performed outstandingly. And a lot of people and research suggests that this is to all these little optimizations. And the reason that I'm telling this story is, first of all, because it's a fun story, and also because what I do, applying psychology in business, and what a lot of UXers do, which is like the UX optimization, kind of shares this thing that sometimes people are not really sure if they need you. They're like, yeah, but do we need this optimizing thing? Do we need all these little improvements? And well, you can refer to this theory that's behind the story as the aggregation of marginal gains. But just telling this story will never again cause you any trouble when people tell them that they don't need you. So yeah, to kick off with that, in my opinion, when I, as a psychologist, look at UX, it's a lot about anticipating and preventing user challenges and creating delight. And a lot of this is in predicting human behavior. And luckily, the science of psychology and behavioral science and neuroscience tell us a lot about how this can be done. Okay, so today we're gonna look at 3 brain and behavior principles that will sharpen your intuition, that will kind of help you get you going with the mindset of a psychologist in UX and get you to work with that. We're gonna kind of look at why people sometimes act illogical or irrational, or as they like to say it in behavioral economics, predictably irrational. And then we're going to go over 7 cognitive biases that influence our decisions. So my name is Jordanov. I'm a cognitive neuropsychologist at Neurified, and I'm mainly responsible for translating all these scientific insights into something practical that professionals can work with. And well, first of all, there are, of course, a lot of books that I have to go through and my team has to go through. I'm going to give you 4 reading tips for if you're into this kind of stuff. You've probably heard of Thinking Fast and Slow. Behavior is also a great book to read. Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock is actually an amazing book on human thinking and decision making. And it's even recommended by Daniel Kahneman, the guy that wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And then there's Nudge, which is another great book on how you can implement behavioral science to improve decision making. And so what I do is I translate all these insights from books, from many decades of scientific articles, and I just distill the key parts, make them understandable and make them actionable for professionals to work with so that everyone can apply behavioral science and neuroscience and psychology in their workflow. And this ranges from a lot of domains, actually. So Neurify, the company that I work with, we do a lot of research, we do a lot of training, we do a lot of consulting. We're also going to launch an online training soon, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And this requires a lot of research that has to be done and has to be put into action. And we do it in a broad area of domains, actually, from marketing communication to transformation to leadership and decision making, but also a lot in user experience. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I would like to start by just telling you what brain and behavior is all about. And to really get it into a nutshell, it's a science that explains how people think, decide, and act. Because if we can get around this, how people think, how people make decisions, and how people behave, it becomes a lot easier to incorporate the human factor and human behavior into your organization or for yourself as a professional. And this amounts to an array of sciences, from behavioral economics and neuroscience to biology, but also systems thinking and cognitive psychology. And we all put it together to bridge this gap between science and business. And that is really what I like to illustrate, to bridge this gap between science and business by showing this scientific standard and the quality of scientific research and the variety of things that you can do with it, but in the speed of business, because sometimes, academics can be a little bit rusty and a little bit slow, which some of you might know. So yeah, that's pretty much all that you need to know about us. Let's just dive into valuable mindset and a model that we have created that it really helps you apply insights from science into your workflow as a professional. But it's also a really good way to look at things. And I call it the brain-centric approach. And this is all about starting with the principles and the fundamentals of something. Because if you want to apply scientific insights, you can go on the internet and read tons and tons of articles about tactics that you can leverage. But it's good to take a step back first. And that's what this brain-centric approach is all about. So it's all about looking, what are the important principles that you're looking at? And so, for example, if we take a business case of attention, we want, for example, to guide the attention, fix the attention, and maintain the attention on a certain ad or landing page or platform. And we need to evoke that sort of attention into the users. So we start with these principles of attentions, for example, neuroscience of attention, which states that attention is a reflexive and intuitive mechanism. And then we move on to the strategy. What are we going to do with this? Well, we're going to guide the user's attention to the desired object or place or a location, and we're going to maintain it there and make sure it's interesting and make sure the brain appreciates what's going on here. Then we move on to the tactics, and now we're in the tactical area. So this is all about selecting the right tactics, so selecting the right tools at your hand. And so, for example, this can be nudging the attention in the desired direction, or leveraging cognitive biases that have to do with attention, like the attentional bias or selective perception. But we're going to get into that later, to the biases. And then it's about operations. How are you going to get these tactics into action for in your own context? And this brain-centric approach is really how I and my team like to view integrating science into your workflow and integrating these insights into human behavior into your workflow as a UX professional. Okay, let's dive into the principles. The first one is a little bit of an overarching one, and you'll probably see and understand why this is true throughout this presentation. It's about logic versus psychologic, because sometimes we really aim to go for the most logical solution of a problem, and we try to get a logical strategy to explain things logically, but mainly people are not that logical. Actually, they're quite irrational, is what science tells us, but in a predictable manner. And that's where we have this dichotomy almost between logic and psychologic. And psychologic, where logic is more about the reality, about rationality, psychologic is more about perception and what you can do with that. And the two of them are not always the same. And while altering the reality, the logical part, can sometimes be extremely costly and hard, altering the perception can be a lot easier, a lot more fun, and probably also at a fraction of the cost. So if you take a look at this, Your brain at this moment is just trying to decipher what is going on. It's trying to see if there's a pattern there, and your pattern recognition machine is running, and maybe you see a zebra or a smiley face, but you don't really know what it is here. And now I'm going to show you what it actually is. Snake, big surprise. And when you see this, your brain is storing this pattern because it thinks that it might be good to remember what is going on here. And now when I tune back into this black and white thing, you actually see the snake. Or I hope you do. That all depends on the internet connection and if this is all going well. But I presume it is. And so what is going on there is this principle of humans and the human brain being a pattern recognition machine that is constantly running these algorithms, seeing if it can recognize something. Does it have to recollect information in your own biological container, which is your head, your body, your skull, and your brain. And the brain, the human brain, is constantly looking for these patterns. And this is key in user experience because this means that the brain of your user is constantly making predictions, constantly looking for patterns, and also constantly making expectations. And knowing the rules of this and knowing how you can meet these expectations using these insights from psychology can be a really good part of your mindset as a professional. Okay, then there is another fun one that I want to show you. And it, again, considers a little bit of a story. So there was this wine tasting event that was hosted by what people thought were, well, some vinologists, but were actually psychologists, and they were out the trick. And so what they did was they presented these wines to a group of professionals, professional wine tasters, professional vinologists. And what they did was they took one of the glasses. It was actually a white wine glass, and they put red coloring inside of it to make it look like red wine. And the thing is, you would think that any professional that tastes this wine is like, yeah, that's lukewarm white wine with coloring and it doesn't taste right. But perception played a way bigger part here. So what happened was that all the professionals there, when they saw that, well, this is probably supposed to be red wine and that I'm going to taste right now, they took a sip and they were saying things like, yeah, it's earthy, special, full body. And their brain was coming up with all kinds of ways to rationalize what is going on here. Well, the reality was that they were just tasting lukewarm white wine with some food coloring. And this tells us again about how perception is so fundamentally different from reality. And while we often try to change reality, it is perception that we should really seek after. Because if you can influence perception, you can be way more effective on a way more larger scale than when you're trying to change the hard reality. Okay, so these three brain principles. Logic does not always equal psychologic. Human pattern recognition machines in the complex algorithms running in the biological containers, and that perception is fundamentally different from reality are just three things that you should always keep top of mind. It's a principled mindset that really helps you think like a psychologist at work and try to guess and predict and guide human behavior a bit better. Okay, then on to something more practical and tactical. This is about cognitive biases, and I can talk for cognitive biases. I can talk hours about it, but I'm not going to today. You can hear me talk about it plenty more if you're interested. I'm just going to explain it really quickly what they are, because you probably heard of them, these cognitive biases. Well, first, let's take a step back. In everyday life, we have to do a lot of things. We have to make a lot of decisions, perform a lot of behaviors, and think about everything at the same time. Actually, scientists estimate that the average human takes about 35,000 decisions each and every day. And the thing is, the brain cannot take all these decisions consciously with full effort. So what it does is it's creating heuristics. It's creating these mental shortcuts that help you really effortlessly make a lot of decisions without you even being consciously aware of it. Which leg you use to get out of bed, when you open your eyes, muscle coordination, but also toothbrushing, driving a car when you're experienced. This is all used with these mental shortcuts to save energy. For those of you who are already like a little bit known with psychology, this is also called system one thinking. But when we use these heuristics, these mental shortcuts, these things that our brain created to make life easier in a context to which it doesn't apply, we get cognitive biases. And we're going to go through a lot of examples. But if you have a textbook definition for cognitive biases, they're irrational but predictable patterns in our judgments and decisions. So there are these irrational deviations from what normal behavior looks like. And if you know them, if you can spot them, you can truly leverage them by designing around them or by alleviating them from your own thinking. But let's get into that a little bit later. What you should know about cognitive biases in UX is that every user has them. They're universal principles of the brain. And you, as a true designer, needs to learn to take that into consideration when you're designing for the human brain. And so you probably heard of loss aversion. It's a textbook example of a cognitive bias. And it just dictates that we humans hate losing way more than we love gaining. So there's this irrational balance in which we would just do way more to avoid a loss than we would to gain something. And well, we're going to get into the practicals of this later, but this is already something to prime your mind. And well, to be honest with you, there are over 200 cognitive biases. And me and my colleagues, we spend a lot of time studying each and every one of them and getting through the bottom of it and truly seeing what the connection between them is and how you, the other professionals, can learn to leverage them or alleviate them in your own context. So these biases, they come from somewhere, of course. They're actually an evolutionary fact of the brain because, you know, we make 35,000 decisions each and every day. And throughout this course of evolution, our brain just had to save energy and deal with that. So, for example, when there's too much information, your brain uses mental shortcuts. The same for when there's not enough meaning in the information you take in. Or you have to take a decision, but you don't have enough time. This is also when shortcuts come in really handy. And also when your memory is just not really serving you well. And all these little aspects, they are really good ground for heuristics. But since our brain is constantly operating on these, often we overextend these heuristics and then we're in cognitive bias territory. So now, before we really dive into how to use this and how to get practical, there are a couple ways in which you can divide this. You can leverage bias by, for example, debiasing yourself, because you can think in a biased way when you're, for example, you're analyzing data or you're interacting with customers. You can debias group decision making. You can when you have a company and you have to make a decision as a group. There's also bias in that, and there are ways to debias it. That's actually what we do when we train leadership teams. We give masterclasses in that as well. And so you can also help others develop their bias awareness. And after this course, after this little session with me, you'll probably start noticing cognitive biases in the people around you. And you can also align yourself with bias. And what I mean with that is spotting bias, knowing that bias is going to occur and design around that. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. I picked a couple of challenges, also some challenges that you, UX Bear community, also forwarded to me. First one is gaining insights from analytics. And I bet that a lot of you are also working with data and are working with inferences and have to analyze. There's lots of bias that can sneak in there. One of them is the confirmation bias. And you might have heard of this one. It's where we just view the world through this lens of our opinions. We see everything only when it truly kind of confirms our existing beliefs. And when we're working with data, you can see actually when you're working with data analysts or data scientists, you can actually make them transform the data in such a way that it will always confirm your hypothesis. There was this quote: when you torture the data long enough, it will confess. And the thing that you have to keep in mind is that this is pretty much inevitable, but there are some things that you can do to arm yourself against confirmation bias. One of them is formulating a really concrete hypothesis before diving into the data. And what I mean with this is be really tough with yourself, be strict and set boundaries of what you think you're going to see. Don't be vague, write it down, and only then look at the data. The other one is way more general, and you can also do this when you're not analyzing data or thinking of insights, holding your opinions loosely. Everyone is entitled to a strong opinion, and I also have a lot of strong opinions, but it's important to hold them loosely. And with that, I mean, when you see evidence, when you see something that it might contradict with your existing opinions, adjust them. Take the liberty to hold your opinions loosely. I think there's this mantra that's called strong opinions loosely held, which are words to live by, actually. Another bias is the focusing illusion, and it's really apparent in your own thinking, and you have to arm yourself for it. It's a tendency to assume that what you're thinking about right now is way more important than it actually is. And we probably see this when we have a deadline coming up or when we're nervous about something, and our whole world revolves around this thing. And it's only because of this focusing illusion that is just dragging us into it. Now, the thing that you can do when you're working with insights, when you're working with data, is to always pitch your data, the assumptions that you make around it, and your predictions that you make from it to someone else. Because chances are high that you're biased. Chances that someone else is biased in the exact same way are a lot lower already, and they can kind of help you break out of your irrational patterns of the focusing illusion and the confirmation bias. Another tip is to formulate at least one alternative hypothesis. And this might sound a bit vague, but it's completely key, because what we've seen in a lot of research is that when people do research, when people make decisions, when people consider something important, they only think about one alternative. They're completely focused on that one alternative. And by just forcing yourself systematically to always pick a second hypothesis, an alternative hypothesis, it becomes a lot easier to break away from your focusing illusion, and it also helps against confirmation bias. All right, now enough about our own bias. Let's dive into another challenge, and this one actually came from the community UX Bears a couple of days ago. It's about willingness to pay, and about what are common motivations in deciding which services are worth paying for and which aren't in the mind of our users. Well, there are a couple of biases involved here, and I'm just going to walk you through all of them. The first one is the zero risk bias. And this is a very, very funny one. And it just dictates that we humans, we always prefer to choose the option that displays the least risk. So the thing that seems the most riskless, that's what we want to go for. Intuitively, our brain is just telling us to do that a lot of the time. And sometimes this might not even be the best option when you think about it rationally. But sometimes we don't think logically, we think psychologically. That's principle again. So the thing that you can do to kind of take this away is, well, I took an example of IKEA. I just recently moved to Utrecht, which is also why I'm in a bit of a weird space giving this presentation. I don't really have set up a really proper video space, so sorry about that. But moving also means that you have to go to IKEA, get some furniture from there. And well, one of the things that I saw there was that they have a lot of biases that they leverage, and that there is a lot of nudging going on, and that it's just all psychology. And these two examples, I'm sorry that they're in Dutch, by the way, but I'll translate them for those who don't speak it. These two examples really help to leverage the zero risk bias. The one on the left just says that whatever it is you bought, you have a full year to return it, and you will get your money back, and everything will be just fine. There is no risk in that. The second one from ABN AMRO is actually about trust signaling. So this quite authoritative name, ABN AMRO, which is a huge bank in the Netherlands, and also abroad, by the way, they say that, well, this is the best shop in the Netherlands, the best shopping chain. You can trust these guys. And this signaling of an authority that this is to be trusted drastically lowers the perceived risk in the people that walk around there. And this can be taken right to an online context when you're designing online, when you're designing user experience. Lowering uncertainty and lowering perceived risk can really help people into making decisions a lot faster, which can be buying decisions or signing up for something. Okay, so to get the concrete, what you can do to leverage the zero risk bias is to minimize perceived risk by leveraging, for example, cancel anytime policies, full refunds, other trust signals, and also by maximizing perceived utility. And this is especially in a B2B context very important, because when you offer a service, for example, people are always going to, like, at some moment the decision maker is going to have to say, yeah, but is it worth it? Is it going to be worth it? And when you can explicitly show that when they do this, when they invest in this, that they will have their money out of it within a week or so, no, that's perfect. Then you drastically lower that perceived risk. Okay, another one is the endowment effect, and this is all about ownership. It's a little bit of a little sister to loss aversion, and it's where we tend to demand much more to give up an object than we're willing to pay to acquire it. And easier said, when we feel ownership over something, we don't want to relinquish that anymore. And I saw another brilliant example in IKEA that can be translated immediately back to your context, which is about these trolleys. And you're walking around with this trolley and you stack all your boxes and your beds and your cabinets and whatever they are up there. And you're like, oh, this is awesome. It doesn't weigh anything, just perfect. And then when you come at the cash register, you have to put it away. You have to relinquish ownership of it. And they know this. And they immediately trigger the endowment effect by saying, hey, you liked your yellow trolley. Here you can buy a blue one to take at home. And this is a textbook, classic, and perfect example of how you can use the endowment effect. But I mean, in an online context, you can use it as well. Think about free trials. Think about free samples. Think about a free chapter, a free access to something. As soon as we have a little bit of ownership and investment in something, we are way more likely to invest more, to want to keep a product. Another really good one here is one that I recently came across, and this is about offering personalization very early on in the process. So, for example, when you run a website or a platform, or you sell something, when you give your users the option to personalize as early on as possible, they immediately feel this perceived ownership. The endowment effect triggers, and they become way more invested and motivated to commit and to pay also for your product or service. Last challenge, and we have to speed up a little bit, is about promoting user loyalty. And I have a couple more biases that I would like to go through. The first one is the goal gradient effect. And we know this one from our LinkedIn profile. And we also know it from Slack, by the way. They're always like, you're always almost there, but not quite. You have to do this and this and that, and then your profile is 100% complete. I bet no one's profile, well, almost no one's profile was 100% complete yet when they first got started. And what's happening here is this really motivates us to go on, to finish what we've started. Starbucks also does this. They give you a card for free coffee, and they already put 2 stamps on it before they give it to you. And it triggers a goal gradient effect that makes you really motivated to come back, to promotes loyalty, to get you to truly be motivated and invest. Well, you can use this goal gradient effect in a lot of ways. MailChimp does it by giving you this little feedback at the end of this process. They give you a high five when you send out an email campaign. It's all these micro interactions. For example, when your users are filling out form fields, make sure that you let them know they're doing well by giving them a little green tick or a little doing great. Like, all these micro feedback signals are great because they trigger this motivational effect. And also you can increase this by increasing the amount of rewards and stimulations that they get over the sales funnel that they're in, over their customer experience or their customer journey. The more intense the rewards get over time, the better they are perceived and the more motivated they become. Okay, the last one, the peak end rule. And this is one you might already know. People don't really remember something by just recalling everything. They remember it by remembering the peak of an experience and the end of an experience. And IKEA, again, if this image is not loading, that's weird. IKEA, again, does this really great. If the image is not loading, that's okay. Because you probably remember that when you buy something there, it might be expensive. You might, oh yeah, there we go. You might have been wandering around for a while, and maybe you didn't have a great time, or maybe you did when you saw your designer cabinet that you wanted. But the last thing you remember is walking out with this hot dog that was only 90 cents. Now, this is, again, IKEA leveraging the peak end rule to the max, because they know that memory works that way. We don't remember the whole thing. We remember the peak and we remember the end. And there are lots of ways that you can implement this, but a really good one is to create a wow moment in each touch point with your customer or with your user, to really make them, really put some extra effort into that wow. And of course, logically, make the end of each touch point memorable. And now these biases, they might seem completely illogical, and that's because they're psychological, but they work incredibly well when you're predicting human behavior, when you're guiding human behavior, and when you're changing human behavior, and should be taken into consideration for each and every one that's in UX. So as a last takeaway, I would just like to talk a little bit about this online course that we're releasing, because we've been in the Corona time. We just sat down with the team and we thought we're going to produce our online academy. We're finally going to do it. And in this course, you can learn everything about these cognitive biases, the principles of brain and behavior, everything that you need to know about psychology and behavioral science to boost your performance as a UX designer, but also in customer success, conversion optimization, online marketing. It's actually great for everyone that works with people. And I can honestly say that I'm quite proud of how this turned out. And it's a really good course. And now I'm going to stop shamelessly promoting myself after I give you all a little sneak peek. And this is something special because you can go to growth.neurified.com. And today I actually uploaded the first chapter on YouTube. And you can watch it for free if you sign up there. And you'll probably be the very first people to see the first chapter of the course that we created over the last 6 months. And I'm really interested in what you think. So please go and watch the chapter. Give me all the feedback. It's completely free. And I'm really, really interested in what you think. And with that, I would like to say thank you. And thank you, UX Bears, for having me. Thank you for organizing this. And I had a great time. Thank you all.
Wow, Philippe, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating talk. And I was a social science major in college, not a doctor, but a bachelor. And I just feel like psychology is so important in the field of UX. And I, for one, am completely sold on the Neurified thing. I will definitely check out that course. So thank you for sharing your expertise with the community. I hope that everyone found it as fascinating as I did. But I want to bring up, there's mainly one question that came up in the comments kind of in different ways, but over and over again, is that while psychology is very important in UX and we use it all the time, every day, and while we're designing, it triggers dark thoughts. There's some people who, like clients in particular, who might want to use it for unethical purposes, or who want to exploit psychology to trick people into doing things. And then us as UX designers often get caught in the middle of feeling like, well, we're the ambassadors of the user. We want to design for good, but we also need to design for the good of our clients. So I think people are just generally wanting to hear your thoughts on that. How do you navigate that line in your work?
Certainly. That's a really good question, Annie. It's something that I think we all think a lot about, especially us in the world of science. Like ethics is a huge part of everything you do each day. Mm-hmm. And I'm really happy that I could also say there is already, like, we dedicated a lot to ethics in the course as well. There's already something about ethics in the first chapter. So I'm really curious about what you all think of that. But my answer here, and I'm also going to throw in a little bit of a personal answer, is that, well, there is a huge weight of ethics that is standing on your shoulder when you possess this knowledge, because it is actual knowledge of how the brain works. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen from time to time is that there are lots of people who are like, oh yeah, now we're gonna manipulate. Now we're gonna really get into. They actually quite enjoy these dark patterns, and they will see some gain on the short term because yeah, these tactics, they do work. But in the long term, our brain has a really good compass for knowing that someone is messing with us, and it's a zero-sum game. Yeah. So our brain totally. This is like an anti-bias. Sooner or later, people figure out that they're being messed with and that it's not in their advantage. And whoever is messing with them, their reputation is going to suffer in the long term for sure. That's given. And that being said, that's the advice that I would give to everyone. Like, be very mindful of the way that you apply your knowledge of behavioral science and psychology, because it's actually quite powerful knowledge, which is also why we really stress like working from the principles of science out to the tactics and the operations, because it really forces you to go from like the center, the human brain, and really align with your users and your customers, and from there on build your strategy, then go into tactics, and then go into operations, instead of just searching on the internet for how can I make my users buy more and going straight to those trick-like tactics, because you know what, tactics without strategy are just tricks, and tricks are fun, but they can really backfire, work in your disadvantage, and I don't really recommend them. And to finish it off, that being said, I had a lot of people telling me that, cognitive biases shouldn't be used or leveraged. But that is something that I do slightly disagree with, because it's not that you kind of throw a cognitive bias over your user, that you trap them in a bias. This is how the human brain works. We have heuristics, we have biases. And the people that design services for us should definitely be mindful of those biases and know how they can design around them in such a way that it will lead to a positive decision-making environment for the user, and of course also a positive user experience. So it's definitely something that you can educate yourself in, and the more you do it, the better, because that is the only way that you can apply these in the proper way, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you so much again. What a fascinating talk. If people want to discuss this further, then there's a session that you can join where you can talk directly with Philippe. And I'm going to close off the event now. and say thank you again to both of our speakers. Two very different but very fascinating topics. Appreciate that you're here again, and I'm going to ask everyone to please join the speakers or join a session to just talk amongst yourself in general, or try out the networking tool. Hopin stays open until everybody leaves, basically, so you can use the next hour or so to catch up with the community. And thank you again for supporting UX Beers during this lockdown time. I know these online events can sometimes be a little bit awkward or weird, and we're spending a lot of time in these virtual meetings, but it's so nice to see you here and see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces. And I hope to see you next month. We'll be here. Have a good night.